The moment she stepped out of the elevator, every head turned. Not because of the cameras already lining the entrance. Not because of the 24 publicists frantically adjusting earpieces and double-checking guest lists. They turned because Sophia Carter had that effect on rooms, a quiet, undeniable gravity that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention whether they meant to or not. She was 32 years old. She ran a technology company that had tripled its valuation in under 4 years, built from 11 employees and a rented office floor into a firm that employed over 2,000 people across 6 cities, and was currently the subject of acquisition interest from 3 of the largest conglomerates in the sector. She did not discuss the acquisition interest publicly. She was not ready to discuss it privately, either. Today was not about what came next. Today was about what had been built, and the formal recognition of that building that the morning's event represented. She stepped through the lobby in a charcoal blazer cut so precisely it looked engineered rather than sewn, moving toward a Ferrari parked at the curb outside that had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The car sat beneath a pale autumn sky, red as a wound against the gray concrete, its finish so deep and polished it seemed to absorb the light around it rather than merely reflect it. This was not simply a vehicle. It was a limited production model, fewer than 200 in existence worldwide, acquired through connections that took 2 years to cultivate, and a waiting list that most buyers never cleared. The people who owned this particular Ferrari did not find it by searching for it. They became the kind of person that a car like this became available to. And then they waited. And then one day the call came. Sophia had received the call 14 months prior, on a Tuesday afternoon. And she had said yes before the sentence was fully finished. She had told herself afterward that she bought it because she understood precision, because she had built her company on the principle that excellence is not accidental, that the space between good and exceptional is precisely where legacies are either made or abandoned. That was true enough. It was also true that she had worked for a decade with a specific image in the back of her mind, a marker she had set for herself in the years when the company was 3 people sharing a conference room they could not always afford, and the Ferrari was the physical form that image had taken. Some ambitions are strategic, some are simply honest. Inside the venue beyond the glass doors, the event was already alive with the low electrical hum of controlled anticipation. 47 international investors occupied the tables nearest the stage, people whose presence here represented not casual interest, but the kind of deliberate alignment that follows months of relationship building and due diligence. 3 strategic partners whose signatures on the morning's contract would open the company to cross-continental markets that Sophia had spent 3 years systematically approaching. A dozen journalists from publications whose coverage shaped the thinking of the people her company needed to reach. The contract itself had been negotiated across 9 months. 9 months of calls that stretched past midnight, of document revisions that accumulated into a stack 14 drafts deep, of legal language refined to the point where every clause meant exactly what it said and nothing it did not. Sophia had reviewed it for the last time the previous evening, alone in her office at 9 o'clock, reading each page with the same focused attention she had given it in the first draft, because that was how she worked. Not from distrust of her team's preparation, but from the understanding that the final read belonged to her. That the responsibility of the signature was hers, and she did not sign things she had not personally verified. She had been up at 4:30 that morning. She had gone over her remarks at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before she reached the end of the second page. She had called her communications director at 6:55 to confirm the media positioning. She had reviewed the investor seating arrangement with her operations manager at 7:20 because she had noticed, the night before, that 2 attendees whose relationship was professionally sensitive had been placed in adjacent seats, and she wanted it corrected before anyone arrived. These were small things. They were also the kind of small things that distinguished events that felt controlled from events that simply happened to go well, and Sophia had long ago made peace with the fact that the distinction mattered to her more than she could rationally justify. By 8 o'clock she was dressed. By 8:40 she was in the car. The city still in the quiet gray half-light of early autumn morning, and the first cameras were already positioned along the approach road as the Ferrari rounded the final corner toward the venue entrance. She pulled forward toward the red carpet approach, heard the engine respond with the deep, self-assured authority it always had when it moved out of a turn, and felt the familiar compression of focus that preceded every significant moment in her professional life. Not anxiety, exactly, but the heightening of attention that the body produces when it understands something important is about to happen, and it intends to be fully present for it. Camera flashes erupted in quick, silent bursts from both sides of the approach. Someone in the crowd made a sound that was not quite a word, the involuntary vocalization of a person confronting something that exceeds their prepared response. The Ferrari rolled forward with the quiet authority of a machine that has never been asked to do anything it cannot do and has no reason to expect that today will be different. Then, without warning, without a stutter or a gasp or any mechanical premonition of what was about to happen, it stopped. The engine cut completely. Every light on the instrument panel died. The car sat in perfect silence, 40 feet from the entrance, in the center of the most photographed moment of Sophia Carter's professional life. And it did nothing at all. She pressed the ignition. Nothing. She pressed it again. Nothing. The silence inside the cabin felt different from ordinary silence. It had a quality she could not immediately name, something between pressure and wrongness, the sensation of a system that has gone not simply quiet but absent. She looked through the windshield at the cameras that were still pointed at her, at the assembled crowd that had stopped moving and was simply watching, and she understood, with the particular clarity that crisis produces in people who are trained to process information quickly, that there was no fast solution here. Whatever was happening was not a momentary glitch. The car was not going to start again in the next 30 seconds. She had 40 feet between her and the entrance, hundreds of eyes on the moment, and a schedule that would not wait. Her security detail reached the car within 30 seconds. Her head of technical operations arrived moments after. They circled the Ferrari with the rapid efficiency of people whose function is to solve visible problems quickly, and they wore the expression of professionals who have encountered something they cannot immediately classify, not panic, but the particular focused seriousness that indicates a problem has exceeded the first layer of expected response. The lead technician asked Sophia to try the ignition. She did. Nothing. He asked her to step out. She did so with the smooth composure she had built over years of being observed in difficult moments, and she stood on the carpet while his team ran through the opening level of diagnostics, and she allowed herself exactly 1 second of acknowledging, privately, that none of her planning had included this particular scenario. The diagnostics produced error codes that the team did not recognize, not in isolation, but in the specific combination they were generating, cascading across multiple systems simultaneously in a pattern that pointed toward everything and resolved into nothing. The car was not simply stalled. Every system that could be engaged externally had entered a state of complete non-response. The event producer appeared at Sophia's elbow at the 8-minute mark and said, with the careful phrasing of someone delivering information they would rather not be delivering, that the opening segment could not be held past its scheduled time. Sophia thanked him and told him to proceed. She rode to her own keynote in a rented executive sedan, sitting in the back seat with her hands in her lap and her attention already redirecting toward everything the morning still required of her. She delivered the speech. She signed the contract. She moved through every exchange the morning required with the fluency of a person who has done the work and does not need to perform confidence, because confidence is simply the appropriate response to preparation. And through all of it, in the space behind the professional surface, was the image of the red car sitting still and silent while the cameras watched. It was not the largest problem she had ever faced, but it was the kind of problem that does not resolve itself simply by being set aside, the kind that waits in the back of things until it is actually solved. The Ferrari was towed to the city's most reputable high-performance service facility before noon. By 2 o'clock, 2 senior technicians with a combined 4 decades of experience in European performance vehicles had reviewed the initial diagnostics and reached the same conclusion: something was wrong, and they did not yet know what. A specialist in Ferrari's electronic control systems was flown in from a regional service center and spent the night running proprietary diagnostic protocols through the car's system architecture. His report the following morning ran to 11 pages. Its conclusion, expressed in careful technical language, was that the cause remained unidentified. Word moved through the networks, where serious mechanics discuss serious problems, and the Ferrari became what those communities call a ghost problem, the specific kind of fault that defies standard diagnostic logic, that appears to shift when examined directly, that makes experienced engineers quietly wonder whether their established frameworks still apply to what they are looking at. Over the following 2 days, specialists arrived from 3 separate service networks. An ECU expert, with experience on prototype racing systems, ran 6 hours of custom diagnostic scripts and produced detailed notes without answers. A mechanical engineer with deep knowledge of Ferrari's intake and fuel delivery systems disassembled and reassembled components with surgical precision, checking every measurement against manufacturer specification, finding each one within acceptable tolerance, finding nothing that explained the failure. A software consultant with cross-brand electronic fault experience reviewed the complete error log and proposed 4 separate hypotheses, each of which was tested exhaustively and eliminated in sequence. The team replaced the primary relay module. They replaced the fuel pressure sensor. They identified 2 marginal chassis ground points, rectified them with fresh contact treatment, and tried the ignition again. The engine turned over once, raising every head in the room simultaneously, then went silent. 3 technicians worked through the second night under portable high-intensity lighting with equipment filling 2 rolling carts, running every established procedure available to them, finding that each procedure returned the same result: a car that all instruments said should be able to start, and that would not start. By the morning of the 3rd day, more than 80 people had directly examined some aspect of the problem. By early afternoon, the count exceeded 100. The man who brought up Daniel Brooks was named Marcus, a logistics manager for the event company that had handled the launch. He raised it carefully, with the self-aware hesitation of someone introducing a suggestion they expect to be rejected, embedding a quiet apology into the phrasing before the idea itself arrived. There was a mechanic he had heard of, he said, not affiliated with any dealership or network, running a small repair operation in the eastern suburbs. His reputation, as Marcus had heard it described on 3 separate occasions from 3 separate sources, was specific. He found things other shops had given up on. People brought him vehicles that had spent weeks at reputable facilities without resolution. Each account Marcus had received told essentially the same story. The name was Daniel Brooks. The reaction in the service facility was direct. 2 senior technicians laughed not maliciously, but with the involuntary candor of people who have just heard something that lands so far outside the plausible range that humor is the honest response. One specialist said, with genuine and careful politeness, that the diagnostic complexity of the problem required resources of a specific caliber. Another was less careful, pointing out that the software architecture of a modern high-performance ECU system represented a category of specialized knowledge that a neighborhood garage was unlikely to have encountered in any meaningful depth, and that at this stage of the investigation, introducing an unvetted variable into the process felt like a step in the wrong direction. Sophia heard the summary of these objections over the phone. She said nothing for a moment. Then she asked her assistant to arrange for Daniel Brooks to come in the following morning, in person, with full access to the car. He arrived in a 10-year-old truck that he parked at the side of the building without apparent concern for how it appeared alongside the vehicles that belonged there. He walked in carrying a small canvas bag that had been washed enough times to lose its original color, wearing work clothes that were clean but clearly used, with grease worked into the crease lines of his knuckles in the permanent way that comes from a career of working with hands inside machines. He was in his mid-40s, with the quiet economy of movement of someone who has learned to conserve effort through long practice of applying it precisely. The room went quiet when he entered, not the respectful quiet that acknowledges authority, but the different quiet of people encountering something outside the expected range and individually managing the recalibration. Daniel looked at the car for a long, unhurried moment, the kind of looking that takes in the whole before it begins to consider the parts. He set his bag down. He crossed his arms. He stood still. When one of the specialists offered to walk him through the diagnostic history, Daniel said, "Please," and listened to the full account without interrupting the error codes, the components tested and replaced, the software interventions, the hypotheses raised and eliminated, and when the specialist finished, Daniel asked 3 questions. When was the car last serviced before the failure? Who performed that service? Had the car been transported or stored in any unusual way in the 2 weeks before the event? The specialists said those questions had already been covered in the initial intake documentation. Daniel said he understood that and asked if he could get the answers anyway. Sophia's assistant provided them. The car had been serviced 6 weeks prior by a contracted detailing and maintenance team arranged specifically for the event, not the regular service center, but a specialty group engaged by Sophia's operations manager for the event preparation. The car had been transported from a storage facility to a pre-event staging location 3 days before the failure, loaded on an enclosed trailer for the move. No incidents had been reported during transport. Daniel nodded. He did not open his bag. He did not approach a diagnostic terminal. He walked around the car once, slowly, stopping at 2 points to crouch and examine details near wheel height. Unremarkable details that the specialists had passed dozens of times without pausing. He moved to the driver's side and opened the hood. He stood looking at the engine bay for 45 seconds, not with urgency, not with the performed concentration of someone aware of being evaluated, but with the settled patience of a person who is not in competition with anyone in the room and can therefore simply look. Then he moved to the passenger side, crouched, and examined something along the inner fender wall. A location so visually ordinary that it would not have suggested itself as worthy of attention to anyone walking by. A younger technician nearby asked what he was looking at. Daniel said, "A sensor." The technician said every sensor had been cleared in the diagnostic sweep. Daniel said, he knew. He reached in with 2 fingers, touched the component, straightened, found a small flathead screwdriver in his bag, returned to the same position, and made a careful adjustment, the repositioning of a small sensor along its mounting bracket, a quarter turn of a fastening screw, a correction so physically small that it required attention and care to execute, but no force, no specialized equipment, nothing that anyone else in the room could not have done with the same tool. Then he stepped back and said, "Try it now." No one moved for a moment. The room had acquired the specific stillness that precedes something people are not sure they believe is possible. The stillness of people who have spent 3 days working at maximum effort and are watching someone who arrived 3 minutes ago do something so simple it cannot be the answer. And yet, Sophia's lead technician stepped forward, sat in the driver's seat, and pressed the ignition. The Ferrari started, not haltingly, not tentatively. It started the way it was designed to start, with a deep, clean, immediate surge of mechanical authority that filled the space and dissolved the silence so completely that the silence before it seemed, in retrospect, impossible. Every warning indicator was gone. Every system read normal. The engine settled into idle with the low, precise, metered rhythm of something that had never been compromised and was simply, at last, allowed to do what it was made for. The fault was in a throttle position sensor on the intake assembly, not broken, not defective. Misaligned by less than 3 millimeters, the result of a conscientious technician reinstalling the intake assembly after cleaning and seating the sensor 3 millimeters from its correct position. The sensor operated. It sent signals, but the signals it sent from the fractionally incorrect position were fractionally wrong, and the ECU programmed with tolerances precise enough to recognize exactly this category of anomaly, interpreted the fractional incorrectness as evidence of a critical system failure, activated its protective shutdown protocol, and locked every system it could reach. Every subsequent diagnostic check found a sensor generating a signal, classified it as functional, and moved on. 114 people had cleared that sensor. Daniel had not cleared it. He had asked what had happened to the car, and the answer had told him where to look. The specialists gathered around the sensor after Daniel stepped away. They measured and confirmed. They reconstructed the full causal chain, the cleaning, the reinstallation, the 3 millimeter displacement, the fractional signal error, the ECU's response. The cascading lockdown and the reconstruction was precise and entirely correct, and did not change anything at all about the fact that one man had resolved in 3 minutes what more than 100 had not resolved in 3 days. There was nothing to dispute. There was only the particular weight of confronting the distance between how a situation had been assessed and what the situation actually was. One of the senior engineers, a man named Robert Harland, who had spent 31 years in precision automotive work, had recognized Daniel's name when Marcus first mentioned it, or believed he had, without being certain enough to say so in a room that had already decided the suggestion was not worth serious consideration. He walked to where Sophia was standing after the verification was complete, and told her quietly that he thought there was something she should know about the man she had brought in. He said the name matched someone from the professional engineering networks, a name attached to a body of work in engine system design that had been, in certain circles, genuinely significant. He said he could not be absolutely certain, but the questions Daniel had asked, and the specific location he had found, and the pattern of his attention, it aligned with a level of thinking that Robert had only encountered in a particular kind of engineer. The kind that was, in his experience, becoming rare. Sophia found Daniel packing his bag with the same unhurried economy he had arrived with. She thanked him. He said it was straightforward, once you knew where the starting point was. She said she had heard his name from someone who thought he might have had a different kind of career before the garage. There was a pause, and then he told her. The first 15 years were mechanical and systems engineering engine design at 2 major manufacturers, including a team project that produced a variable intake system later adopted across a product line selling in the hundreds of thousands of units annually. Technical publications. Conference presentations. 4 recruitment offers in 6 years, each more complex and better compensated than the last. Several years during which his name circulated in the professional conversations that occasionally shaped the direction of development programs worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Then his wife became ill, and the illness was long, and she died. And his daughter was 7 and his son was 5. And for a period after that, he did not work at all. When he returned to work, he returned slowly, testing the edges before committing weight. He found a small garage in the eastern suburbs. He found, with some surprise, that he preferred it to everything he had done before, not because it asked less, but because what it asked for was the part of him that had always been most genuine. The diagnosis, the patience, the willingness to stay with a problem until it explained itself. No performance of competence required. No metrics calibrated to things that had no relationship to whether the actual work was good, just the problem, and the person applying their full attention to it. He said, I used to lead with my title. I introduced myself as my job, before I introduced myself as a person. I do not remember the specific day I stopped doing that. I remember being different afterward, closer to something true than I had been in a long time. The engineers who had laughed at the suggestion of his name were not laughing now. Some occupied themselves on the far side of the room. Others stayed where they were and listened with the sustained attention of people hearing something they recognize from a place they do not usually examine in professional settings. Robert Harland stood with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has spent enough years in a field to understand that expertise and wisdom are not always the same thing, and who was quite certain about which one he was currently in the presence of. Sophia made her offer directly and without decoration. A consulting arrangement, his terms, structured around specific problems that her internal teams had been unable to resolve within a defined window. 3 engagements per quarter. His schedule, no title required, no ongoing organizational presence, no metrics that did not relate to whether the problem in front of him was solved. She said, I am not asking you to return to something you left. I am asking whether what I am describing is actually different from that, or whether it only sounds as though it might be. He declined the first time, and explained why clearly. The environments he had returned to after his wife died had asked for a version of himself he no longer wanted to provide the performance of visibility, the optimization for metrics that measured presentation rather than result. He had drawn the boundary carefully. He intended to hold it. She listened without interruption, and then made the offer a second time with greater precision, removing the elements he had named as the problem, being specific about what would remain. He listened. He said he would think about it. She said that was more than she had expected, and she meant it exactly as she said it. 12 days later he called. He accepted the terms as stated, with 2 clarifications she agreed to without hesitation because they were reasonable and fair. He continued his work at the garage, the transmissions, the electrical faults, the brake replacements that kept the business operational and the week structured. 3 times a quarter, his phone rang with a different category of problem. 3 times a quarter he drove to wherever it was and stayed with it until it resolved. His record across the first 4 months was complete. Every problem closed. The information moved through the company, the way true things move not by announcement but by accumulation, until it became the kind of established fact that shapes how people approach their work without anyone having formally declared it should. Sophia sat in the Ferrari on a quiet Thursday morning in the company parking structure. Engine running. The car once again exactly what it had always been, precise, powerful, calibrated to tolerances that expressed, in physical form, the belief that perfection is a worthy target. She sat with the engine running, and the pale morning light coming in at an angle through the open upper level of the structure, lying in long lines across the concrete floor, and she let herself think about what the last 3 weeks had actually taught her. The 114 specialists had not been inadequate. They had been stopped by an assumption so fundamental that no one in the room had examined it, that when a component reports functional, functional means correct, that what the instrument says is the same as what is true. That green means good. It does not always mean good. Sometimes it means that the instrument is asking the wrong question. Sometimes the gap between present and correct is smaller than any tool is calibrated to detect, and the only way across that gap is to stop asking the instruments and start asking the people what happened, and when, and who was there, and what exactly did they do. She pressed the accelerator gently and listened to the engine respond, immediate and certain, filling the concrete space with something that sounded, in the right silence, like a form of proof. 114 specialists had searched for the answer in the most sophisticated systems available to them. The man who found it was the one who had been quiet long enough to hear the simplest question in the room. He had arrived without credentials displayed on his clothing, without equipment that commanded attention, without the accumulated weight of institutional endorsement that the others had brought as their introduction. He had arrived with one thing that none of the others had thought to bring: the willingness to ask how the problem started, before he asked where it was. That single distinction between origin and location, between what happened and what the readout reported, had been the difference. It had always been the difference, and it was, in the end, the only qualification that had ever truly mattered. The story spread through the company's internal networks the way consequential stories do not through any announcement or official communication, but as something passed person to person, accumulating specificity and weight as it traveled. The Ferrari. 3 days, more than 100 specialists, 3 minutes. The specifics shifted modestly in the retelling, as specifics do in every organization where a story becomes larger than the event that generated it, but the essential facts remained intact because the essential facts were too plain to be confused. A problem that had resisted every sophisticated tool available had been solved by someone who had not used a sophisticated tool. He had used a question. The question had been simple. The answer had been in the room the entire time, waiting for someone to ask for it in the right way. There is a particular kind of discomfort that settles over organizations when something like that happens, when the path to a solution turns out to have been so straightforward that its absence for 3 days becomes a more complicated story than its discovery in 3 minutes. It is not a comfortable discomfort. It does not resolve cleanly into a lesson that can be framed and mounted. It sits in the space between the people who were present and the knowledge of what they brought and what they missed, and it tends to produce, in people who are honest with themselves, a slow and unwelcome examination of the assumptions they carry into every problem, the ones they have never needed to name because they have never been explicitly wrong before. The engineers in Sophia's hardware and systems division did not hold a meeting about what had happened. They did not need to. The account reached them through the channels by which accounts of that kind travel, and it reached them with enough specific detail to be credible and enough directness to be felt. A few of them, particularly those who had been among the louder voices dismissing Marcus's suggestion, in the first place found reasons to be busy with other things when the topic came up in conversation. Others engaged with it directly, which was the harder response, but the more useful one. Robert Harlan talked about it once, briefly, to the group he worked most closely with. He said that in 31 years of precision technical work, the failures he remembered most clearly were not the ones that went wrong in obvious ways. They were the ones that went wrong quietly, in the narrow territory between what was technically true and what was actually correct. He said, "A sensor can be working and wrong at the same time. A person can be working and wrong at the same time. The question is not always whether the system is generating output. The question is whether the output means what you are assuming it means." No one said anything for a moment after he finished. Then someone asked what the first question should be, if not the one they had been trained to ask. Robert said he thought that was probably the right question to be sitting with, and he moved on to other things. Sophia thought about Daniel Brooks more than she had expected to in the weeks that followed. Not because the situation itself was unresolved, it was fully resolved. The car was operational, the consulting arrangement was in place, the event had gone well by every metric that mattered. She thought about him for the same reason she tended to think about things that had exposed a gap between her model of a situation and the situation itself, because she was someone who had built her capacity for judgment by paying close attention to the moments when that judgment had failed her. And this was one of those moments. She had looked at Daniel Brooks when he arrived, and seen someone who did not belong in the room where the most expensive car she had ever owned was being examined by the most credentialed specialists she could assemble. She had looked at his clothes, and his truck, and his canvas bag, and processed all of it through a framework that sorted signals of competence quickly and efficiently. Because in her experience, that sorting was productive and reliable. She had never required it to be infallible. She had never thought seriously about the cost of the times it was wrong. The cost, in this case, had been 3 days, 3 days of 114 people working the problem from the wrong starting point, because the right starting point was not the kind of place her framework directed attention. It was too small, too unmarked, too unannounced, exactly like the sensor. She had a standing meeting with her senior leadership team every Monday at 8 o'clock. The week after Daniel's consulting arrangement was finalized, she arrived at that meeting a few minutes early, before the others had come in, and she stood at the window, looking at the city, and thought about what she wanted to bring into the room. She had a long list of operational items, as she always did. She had a report on the previous quarter's performance metrics. She had a strategic planning document that required the group's input, and she had, sitting in the back of her mind, the question of whether any of what they were about to discuss was the equivalent of a sensor sweep, whether they were asking whether the signal was present when they should be asking whether the signal was correct. She did not frame it that way in the meeting. She had not entirely decided yet what the right way to frame it was, but she found, as the meeting proceeded, that she was asking different questions than she usually asked, not dramatically different, not so different that anyone named them, but shifted slightly toward origin rather than location, toward what happened rather than what the current reading said. She caught herself twice, starting a question the old way and redirecting it, and once she let a silence sit for a moment longer than she normally would, and in that silence, one of her engineers said something that changed the direction of a conversation in a way that turned out to be significant. She noted it without comment. Daniel, in the meantime, had returned to the eastern suburbs and the work he had returned to after his wife died. A transmission in a 15-year-old domestic sedan belonging to a retired teacher who could not afford the dealership's estimate. An intermittent electrical fault on a delivery van whose owner had been to 3 other shops and been told the problem was untraceable. A recurring fuel system issue on a vehicle that had been diagnosed twice as requiring an engine replacement and had required, as it turned out, a careful cleaning of a component that had been overlooked both times because it was not in the standard diagnostic sequence. He ate his lunch in the same plastic chair he had occupied for 7 years. In the back of the garage where the afternoon light came through the high window in a particular way that he had noticed years ago and had noticed every day since. He was not unaware of what had happened at the service facility, or of what it had set in motion. He was simply not organized around it. He had done what he had always done, which was to look at the thing in front of him until it told him what it needed. The thing in front of him that afternoon was a carburetor that had been cleaned incorrectly and was running lean on the right cylinder, and he gave it the same attention he gave every problem that came through the door, and when he was done, he tested it and found it right, and that was sufficient. The first call came from Sophia's company on a Tuesday, 40 days after the consulting arrangement was finalized. A product team's testing hardware, a custom validation rig used for component stress testing, had been producing inconsistent results for 3 weeks. The internal diagnostics showed the hardware as functioning within specification. The results it was generating, however, could not be replicated by any independent method, which meant the data it was producing could not be trusted, which meant 3 weeks of validation testing was potentially unreliable, which created a problem of significant consequence for a product development timeline that did not have 3 weeks to lose. Daniel arrived the following morning. He spent 40 minutes with the rig before he said anything to the engineers in the room. Then he asked who had calibrated it last, and when, and whether the calibration had been performed with the rig at operating temperature or at ambient temperature. The calibration had been performed at ambient temperature, because that was the standard procedure. Because the calibration specification sheet did not specify temperature conditions, because it had always been done that way. Daniel said, the thermal coefficient of the primary measurement component shifts the reference point by a small but consistent margin as the rig warms to operating temperature. The calibration at ambient temperature sets a baseline that is accurate at ambient temperature. At operating temperature, the baseline drifts. The drift is small enough that it falls within the instrument's stated tolerance, but the test the rig is running has a finer required accuracy than the instrument's stated tolerance, and so the drift is small enough to pass the instrument check and large enough to make the results unreliable. The room was quiet for a moment. One of the engineers said, "That is not in the calibration manual." Daniel said, "I know," he said. "The manual was written for the instrument's stated tolerance. Your application requires more than the instrument's stated tolerance. The gap between those two facts is where your problem lives. It took 2 hours to recalibrate the rig correctly and validate the correction. The product team went back to the 3 weeks of data and applied the correction factor, and found that the underlying test results were consistent and reliable and could be trusted. The timeline held. Sophia received the summary in a brief from her operations director, 3 paragraphs long, factual in its description, and she read it twice before setting it aside. The second call came 6 weeks after that, from a different division, a different category of problem. Then the third, 2 months later, in the context of a software integration issue that had been blocking a significant partnership implementation for 11 days. Daniel was not a software engineer. He made no claim to be one, but he asked the right person the right question at the right moment in the investigation. A question about when the integration had last been tested in the full production environment rather than in the staging environment, and what the differences between those environments were, and the answer led, within 4 hours, to an environment variable that had been set correctly in staging and incorrectly in production, a distinction invisible to every automated test that had been run because the automated tests were running against the staging configuration. His record across the first 4 months was complete. The information moved through the organization quietly, becoming part of the fabric of how things were understood internally rather than something that needed to be formally announced. People began using his name as a verb, in the way that technical communities sometimes adopt a person's name to describe a particular method asking, before finalizing a diagnosis, whether anyone had Danieled it yet, meaning whether anyone had gone back to the beginning and asked what had actually happened before the problem presented itself. Sophia did not tell this to Daniel when she spoke to him. She did not think he needed to know it. She thought, in fact, that knowing it might be exactly the kind of thing that would complicate his relationship to the work in the way all the previous things had complicated his relationship to work: the attention, the recognition, the institutional framing of what he did as something that could be named and praised, and therefore also expected and evaluated, and eventually diminished. She kept it in the category of things that were true and useful to know, and did not require transmission. She thought about his wife sometimes, unexpectedly, not with sentimentality, but with the particular seriousness of someone who has been reminded, by a specific and concrete sequence of events, that the category of loss she had always understood abstractly as something that happens to people is a specific thing that happens to specific people in specific ways, with specific and permanent effects on the shape of the life that follows. She had never lost anyone like that. She was aware, in the way that healthy people in their 30s are sometimes aware, that she had not yet been asked to carry the weight that some people carry, and that her current understanding of certain things was the understanding of someone whose framework for them had not yet been tested. Daniel's framework had been tested. What he had built afterward, the garage, the work, the particular quality of attention he brought to problems, was what a person builds when they have passed through the kind of test that strips away what was not actually necessary and leaves what is. She sat in the Ferrari in the parking structure a second time, weeks after the first, on another quiet morning before the building had fully filled. The engine was running. The light was coming through the upper level at a different angle than it had before. The season further along, the mornings darker earlier. She had a long day ahead. The company's next significant milestone was 4 months out, and the preparation required was already underway. And she was, as she always was in the approach to something large, moving through the days with the compressed focus of a person who has set every available variable into alignment and is holding them there by the sustained application of attention. She was aware, as she had not always been, of the difference between that and certainty. The variables she had aligned were aligned correctly, as far as she could tell, which was a statement that had always seemed sufficient to her and now seemed, slightly, like it required a qualification. As far as she could tell, given the questions she had thought to ask. As far as she could tell, given the instruments she had remembered to check. As far as she could tell, given the assumption that functional means correct. It was not paralysis to acknowledge this. It was not a reason to slow down or to doubt the preparation that had been done well. It was simply the understanding that the checklist of things to verify must include, near the top, the question of whether the checklist itself is asking the right things. 114 specialists had looked for the answer in the most complex systems available to them. The man who found it had not used a complex system. He had asked a simple question and followed the answer to a place that the complex systems had marked as safe and moved past. He had arrived without visible credentials, without equipment that commanded respect, without the institutional endorsement that the room had used as its primary measure of who was worth listening to. He had found, in 3 minutes, what no other method in 3 days had found. And the finding had not required genius. It had not required superior knowledge. It had required the willingness to start from what actually happened, rather than from what the instrument panel reported, to treat the absence of an obvious answer not as evidence that the answer was complex, but as reason to ask whether the question had been correctly formed. That was the lesson, if it was a lesson. Not that experts fail, because experts do not always fail. And the 114 specialists had brought genuine skill and effort to a real problem. Not that simple is always better than complex, because complexity exists for reasons and addresses things that simplicity cannot. The lesson, if that was the right word for it, was narrower than either of those and more actionable. That the gap between functional and correct is a real gap, and it is not always detectable by the instruments that measure functionality, and finding it requires a different kind of question than the instruments are designed to ask. It requires someone willing to go back to the beginning, to what actually happened before the symptoms appeared, and to follow that thread to its end before reaching for the diagnostic equipment. It requires, at minimum, the humility to ask. More than 100 specialists had searched. One man had listened. The difference between those two things was not equipment, and it was not experience, and it was not intelligence. It was the direction of the opening question. One group had asked, "What is the car doing wrong?" One man had asked, "What was done to the car?" Both questions looked, from a distance, like the same investigation. They were not the same investigation. The first one ran through the car's systems and found them functional. The second one ran through the car's history and found a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks earlier, when a careful and conscientious technician had reinstalled a component 3 millimeters from where it needed to sit and had had no way of knowing that the margin of error was smaller than the margin that any standard tool would detect. The Ferrari started every time now. It started the way it had always been designed to start, with the deep, immediate authority of something made to a standard that does not allow for ambiguity. Sophia drove it to the office on most mornings and thought, occasionally, about the sensor that had brought it to a stop. The small, unremarkable component that had told the truth about its own position and been believed without question, and had been wrong, and had brought everything to a halt for 3 days. She thought about all the sensors she was trusting. She thought about which of them she had verified, and which she had simply checked, and whether there was a difference, and whether she would know the difference if one of them was reading from 3 millimeters off position, generating a signal that any instrument would classify as functional and any careful person would classify as present, neither of which, in the end, was the same as correct. There is a version of this story that ends with the lesson announced plainly packaged cleanly for easy transport, delivered in the form of a principle that can be quoted and remembered and applied. But the lesson that Sophia carried out of the parking structure was not that kind. It was the kind that simply begins to change how you move through rooms, how quickly you speak after listening, how long you sit with a problem before deciding you already understand it. It was the kind that does not arrive all at once but accumulates in small increments across many subsequent mornings, as the person who carries it encounters situation after situation where the first question that comes to mind is the functional question, and the useful question is something quieter and harder to ask. 114 specialists had arrived with everything the problem was supposed to require. One man had arrived with one thing they had not thought to bring. The car had started, the room had gone silent, and in that silence, the particular silence of people confronting something they cannot immediately explain, the most important question in the room had finally been answered, not by the most sophisticated tool available, but by the most basic one, someone willing to ask how this started, before asking where it was.